Take a look at this beautiful website. It's all hand-coded with just HTML and CSS. It's professionally designed and it works beautifully even on mobile devices. Wouldn't it be super amazing if you knew exactly how to design and code any website just like this one? Well, that's where I come in. I am Jonas, a developer and designer from Portugal, and I'm gonna teach you HTML, CSS, and professional web design in this course, all by building the stunning website that you just saw from complete scratch. So the goal of this course is to take you step by step from a complete beginner all the way to building real-world websites, while using tools and technologies that professional developers use every single day. Now, in order to build real-world websites, you will learn real-world skills, starting with the basics of semantic HTML, modern CSS, and building layouts using tools like Flexbox and even CSS Grid. You will then learn easy-to-use design guidelines so that you become one of the few developers who can also design. And with these skills mastered, we move on to the OmniFoot project, where I will show you how to plan websites, how to use common design components and layout patterns, and how to find and use free design assets. We will also make our website work on mobile devices, optimize it for top performance, and even launch it to the internet. And to make sure that you become a confident and independent developer, we will follow industry best practices, write clean and organized code, and learn how to fix coding mistakes throughout the entire course. Now, once you sign up for the course, you get immediate access to over 35 hours of up-to-date videos, downloadable course slides, many coding challenges to practice, friendly and fast support, and of course, you can even keep the OmniFoot project for your portfolio to impress potential clients or employers. So this is truly a complete package to get you started with web design and web development. And don't just take my word for it. It's been proven by tens of thousands of happy students who made this the best-selling HTML and CSS course on Udemy. So no matter if you want to learn how to build amazing websites, or if you just want to pick up HTML and CSS to start your web development career, this course is for you. And so don't wait, join me in the course right now, and I see you inside. Hello and welcome to your brand new course, Build Responsive Real-World Websites with HTML and CSS. And if this is your very first contact with any coding of HTML or CSS, then let me also welcome you to the exciting world of web development. I'm sure that you're gonna love it. Now, as the name of the course says, this course is all about using the languages of HTML and CSS to build beautiful, responsive, and also real-world website. And so this course basically covers 4 big topics: web design, HTML and CSS of course, and responsive design. And this course is, in my opinion, the very best way of learning all this that you will find anywhere. So really, you have come to the right place here. Now, before we start learning, let's take a couple of minutes to get a quick overview of how the course is organized and structured, and also the projects that we're going to build together. So basically, that you know exactly how this course is going to work. So this course is divided into 9 sections with a total of 35 hours of video content. And it starts right here in section 1, where you will get a high-level overview of web development in general, and you will also build your very first but extremely simple web page just to get you excited for what's ahead. Then, in section 2, we're gonna move to the very basics of the HTML language by building a small project to give you a solid foundation for the rest of the course. After that, in section number 3, you're gonna learn the foundations of CSS. So things like styling text, the CSS box model, and sizing and positioning elements. And we will even talk about some developer skills such as redocumentation and debugging. Moving on, section number 4 is all about building layouts using CSS. So basically, it's about how to arrange elements on the page in a logical way. And we can do that in multiple ways in CSS, and so we will learn all of them, but actually focus more on modern technologies called Flexbox and CSS Grid. Then, in section 5, we take a small break from web development and move on to web design. And this is actually a really special section, which could in fact be an entire course on its own. So here I teach you countless easy-to-use design rules and design guidelines so that you can not only build interfaces, but also know how to make them beautiful and professional looking. And there are actually not many people who are good at development and design at the same time. And so this part of the course is going to be a great opportunity for you. Next up is section 6, where we will learn all about common website components and common layout patterns that many websites out there use, so that then you can build your own websites in the future using these patterns too. And we will do this by looking at a ton of examples and also by building some components with HTML and CSS ourselves. Finally, sections 7, 8, and 9 are all about building our big course project, which is called Omnifoot. So here we will finally build that beautiful, responsive, and real-world website that this course is all about. And to do this, you're going to use all the skills that you have accumulated up until this point, and of course also learn a lot of new stuff, such as how to plan and sketch a website, how to make it responsive, and really how to handle such a big project from start to finish. So just look at this beautiful project right here. By the end of the course, you will be able to design and build something just like this on your own. And that is just amazing, right? Now, besides all this, there are also many coding challenges and also other opportunities for you to practice the HTML and CSS skills that you keep acquiring over the course of this course. Because practicing is actually the single most important thing that you really need to do in order to learn coding. Alright, so I hope that you're gonna have a ton of fun with this course now, that you become ready to build your own websites, and that you will have a successful start into your web development career. And with that being said, let's now finally get started. Welcome back. Let's now very quickly learn what HTML actually is and what we can do with it. So basically, HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And remember how we learned earlier that HTML is one of the core web technologies along with CSS and JavaScript, right? Now, HTML is a markup language that we web developers can use to structure and describe the entire content of any web page. So notice how I said markup language, because HTML is really not a programming language. It's a markup language because we use it to describe something. And in the case of HTML, we do describe content using elements. So we have different elements that we can use to describe different types of content. So for example, we have the P element that already used in the lecture where we created our very first web page. And so we use the P element there to create a paragraph. But we really have kinds of different elements. So elements to create links, to create page headings, images, video, and a lot more, as you will learn throughout this section and basically throughout the entire course. Then, as we also learned in that lecture where we built our very first web page, web browsers such as Google Chrome do essentially understand HTML code and can render it as a fine website. So a website that we can see in the browser. Okay, so this is essentially what HTML is and what we can do with it. But now let's just zoom in a little bit and take a look at the anatomy of an HTML element. So basically, take a look at the building blocks of each HTML element. And again, we are looking at the paragraph element here, as you can see by the P. And so all of this here is actually the element itself. Now, an HTML element is usually made up of three parts. First is the opening tag, which is the name of the element. So in this case, it's the P, wrapped in the less than in the greater than symbols. Probably they have other names, but that's how I like to call these symbols. So it's less than, P, and then greater than. Then after that, we have basically the content of the element. So in this example, that is just text, but there might be other types of content. For example, an element can contain in itself another element, which we then call a child element. Also, some elements, such as images, have actually no content at all and have only an opening tag. And all of this will, of course, become very intuitive as we start writing HTML. This is just so that you know what I'm talking about when I speak of opening tag or closing tag or content. And speaking of the closing tag, it is basically the same as the opening tag, but with a slash. So we open this paragraph element simply with the P, and we then close it with /P. Okay? Now for elements that do not have content, such as the image element that I mentioned before, we actually omit the closing tag. So in that case, we only have the opening tag, and that's it. And we will see that in action, of course, once we start integrating images into a web page. Okay, and that's really all you need in order to start learning HTML in practice, which is exactly what we will do in the next lecture. Welcome back. So the first thing that we need to learn about HTML is the common HTML document structure. So a structure that each and every HTML document needs to have. But let's start by taking a very quick look at the project that we're going to build throughout this section. So we are building the code magazine. So as you can see here, and in this code magazine, we are building this very simple kind of blog post called the basic language of the web. So we have some links here, we have images, we have some bold text, we have, here you see we have some italic text, we have lists, and yeah, so there's a bunch of stuff that we will learn in this section so that by the end you will have learned the fundamentals of HTML and will end up with this project. Okay. But anyway, let's now finally get to work. And the first thing that we need to do again is to create our project folder. So let's go back to our desktop or to where you are working with your files. And what I'm going to do is to open up this folder that we just downloaded in the last section. So basically the starter code. And then I'm going to reach into this starter folder and grab a copy of the starter files here. So I will copy this folder and put it on my desktop right here. Now, instead of doing that, you could also simply go ahead and use this folder here as your project folder. but that might lead to some confusions. So I always prefer to simply copy this folder here to somewhere else. Okay, let's go back to VS Code. Can actually close this. And then let's come here to the menu and then File and open a new window. All right. Right here, we can select Open Folder, or we can also expand the sidebar here and click on Open Folder right here. So remember that this will define our project folder. So I'm going to my desktop and then select this folder that I just created there. So open, and there we go. So we can close this one now and push this one to the left side. This panel we don't need. And then here inside of our project folder, we can, just like before, create a new file, and we will once again call it index.html. So it's just a regular file with the HTML file extension and the name of index, which should always be the page of any website. All right. So as mentioned before, we have some images here as our starter files and also this text file here. So let's actually also open up this file. And now I will click this icon here to collapse this sidebar to give us some more space. Okay. Now remember how in the first section we used this kind of cheat to create our HTML structure. So we wrote the exclamation mark and then tab, and that then gave us all of this structure. However, to properly learn HTML, we of course need to know how to write all of this structure on our own. And so that should always be the first thing that we learn in HTML. So we start with an empty page, and then the first thing that we need to do is to declare a so-called doc type. So just write the less than symbol, exclamation mark, and then doc type. And you see that VS Code is actually trying to autocomplete this here for us, but let's just write it all by hand so that this code basically sticks in your memory. Okay? So we have to write exclamation mark doc type HTML in order to basically tell the browser that this document uses HTML. Next up, we need to create an HTML element. So remember from the last lecture that to create an element, again, we use the less than symbol, then the name of the element, which in this case is HTML, and then we close that. And once again, VS Code automatically now closes that element for us. So it created this closing tag. Now, in case you don't want that, you can actually turn off that functionality. And let me show you how. So again, you come here to the settings, and then the name of this setting is called auto close tags. And actually, I will turn it off for now so that you can really write this code by hand instead of having VS Code helping you. So we will turn this back on a bit later, but for now, I really want you to learn how to write these elements by hand without any help. Now, so we have the opening and the closing tag of the HTML element. And now as for content, we will actually put another element inside it. So let's give ourselves some space here. And then inside of the HTML, we want first a head element. So let's write it, opening, and I will then immediately close it actually, because for now we will not put any content in there. Okay, so the head and then the body. And I will explain in a second what each of these actually is. So each and every HTML document always needs to start with the HTML element like this. Then inside of this element, as we just put, we need one head element and one body element. Now, the head element is basically for things that are not visible in the browser window. So this head will contain the page title, some additional information about the page, a link to CSS files, or other things. And as we go through the course, we will fill this head with all kinds of different elements. But for now, all I want to do is to just specify the title. So let's use the title element for that. And this page I want to call the basic language of the web, HTML. So basically that's the title here of this blog post as well. Okay, and then we need the closing tag of this element. Okay. Then body is actually for all the elements that will be visible on the page. So the elements that we see here in the browser will always be inside of the element. And just to show it to you, instead of leaving it empty, let me put code here. So I will again use the heading 1 element, so h1, that we used in the very first coding lecture. And let me just grab this tag from here. So that's the content, and then again closing it. All right. Now we haven't saved this file yet, but as we do, Prettier will again format this file for us. So let's give it a save. And you see that now we have the correct indentation. And by indentation, what I mean is that since this head element, for example, is inside the HTML, it should have some space here to make that visually obvious. Okay, basically this is just a tab here. So if I hit the tab key, then it will add another level of indentation. And so now it's at the same level as the title, which doesn't make sense because the title is also inside of the head, right? So we have head inside of HTML, and then inside of the head, we have the title element. And therefore, it has another level of indentation, okay? Now, this is just for aesthetic reasons to make our code more readable. So the browser really doesn't care about this indentation, but it is still important for us to be able to read the code. So again, let's give it a save. And I think we are ready now to actually go ahead and open this in the browser. So let's come to our project folder and then double click index.html. And nice, here it is. Let's put it here first, close up this one. But I will also leave this demo open just so we see what we want to achieve in the end. Okay, let's close up this one here. And with this, we learned the basic structure of HTML. So let's just quickly review. So every HTML document always needs to start with the so-called doc type. And so this will let the browser know that we are actually using HTML in this file. And all browsers will then know that they should use the HTML5 specification to render this HTML. Then we have the HTML element, which is always the parent element of both the head and of the body. So this structure is really always the same in all web pages. We always need to have an HTML element with a head and with a body. Now, what we put into the head and the body is optional, but having these two is not optional. So we always need head and body. Now, in this situation, all we put in the head is just the title element, but here we can put all kinds of other stuff that are not visible or that are not rendered here in this main part of the browser. On the other hand, the content that we actually want to be rendered here should go into the W. And so that's why having this h1 element here that then appears visible on the page. Okay, and that's it. That's the basic HTML structure for each and every HTML document that you really need to know. And with that, let's move on to the next lecture where we will learn a couple of new elements for working with text. So I hope to see you there soon. Welcome to the first lecture about CSS. So just like we did in the HTML fundamentals section, in this section we will also start by looking at what CSS actually is, and we will learn some common terminology so that you always know what I'm talking about when I refer to different pieces of the CSS code. So, first of all, CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And just like HTML, CSS is also one of the core technologies of the web. Now, remember that we use HTML to basically describe the content of a page. And on the other hand, we use CSS to describe the visual style and the presentation of the content that we previously wrote using HTML. So CSS and HTML work very closely together. And in fact, down here, you can see a web page, which is actually the project that we will build later in the course. So in the left side, you have just the content, so just the HTML. And then on the right side, you have the exact same HTML code, but with a lot of CSS. And so that CSS describes the visual style and also the layout, basically, of that whole content. Now, as you already know, HTML consists of a bunch of different elements that we can use to describe the content. And so, again, CSS is similar to that because CSS consists of countless properties that we developers can then use to format the content. And these properties allow us to format different things about the font, the text, the general spacing, the layout of the page, and so on and so forth. There is really lots of different properties, and of course you don't need to know all of them by heart. There's just no need for that. The way that you learn properties is that you use the most important ones over and over again, and at one point it will then become very intuitive. Okay, so this is what CSS is all about. So let's now take a look at an actual piece of CSS code. So this is what a typical small piece of CSS might look like. And it always starts with a selector. So for example, if we want to style all the H1 elements on the page, we need to select it in CSS, and then we can apply some styles to it. And so each of these styles, we can call it a decoration. So for example, here we set the font size to 20 pixels. And so that font size is called the property, and the 20 pixels is the value that we declare for that font size property. And so property and value is a declaration. And we can also more casually call that a style. Then all of these declarations or styles together make up the declaration block. So we have these curly braces after the selector, and so inside of the declaration block go all the different declarations, so all our styles. And all this, so basically the selector plus the declaration block is what we call a CSS rule. And so what this means is that in the end, our CSS code will be a lot of different CSS rules, one after another, where we select all of our elements and style them in any way that we want. Okay, and so that is exactly what we will be doing in the next video. So let's go there right now. In this lecture, we will learn about 6 properties to style text with CSS. And let's just quickly recap what we did in the last lecture. So we are writing external CSS in this CSS file, and the CSS file is always composed of multiple CSS rules. So right now we only have one CSS rule, but of course we will now start more of them. Now a CSS rule always starts with a selector. So in this case we are selecting the H1 element. But if there were more H1 elements, then the selector would actually select all of them. Then we have this declaration blocker into which we can write one or more declarations like this one. And declaration has this property name, so in this case the color, and then the value that we specify for that property, which in this case is this keyword of blue. Okay, and so now we will start adding some more properties here. And the first one that I want to use is the font size. So here we can basically specify the size of the text. And each property can take different types of values, such as length or keywords. So you see that here in the color, the value is a keyword. But now here in the font size, we actually need a length. So basically the size of the text in this case. Now we can specify length using different units in CSS, but don't worry about that for now. So for now, we'll simply use the very simplest one, which is pixels on your screen. So we can specify the font size, for example, to 26 pixels, then add a semicolon here. And so now the text on the screen will be exactly 26 pixels of your physical screen. So if I give this a save now, then you see that the text here decreased. And just remember that in case it didn't update on your computer and you are successfully connected to the live server, as you can see down here, then just manually reload the page here once, and then in the success states here of the code, it will then automatically reload your page. But anyway, let's now start adding the next property, which is the font family. And so here you can specify basically different fonts for your text. So just like you can specify a font in something like a Word document or a Google Page document, you can do the same in CSS. However, what's different in the case of CSS is that you cannot simply use a font family that you have installed on your computer. That wouldn't then work for all the users that are going to visit your page in the future, unless they also have that font installed on the computer, right? So there is a solution for that we will talk about later, but for now we will simply not actually specify a real font family, but instead just use the keyword that we want the browser to use any font size that is a sans serif. And sans serif, we will also learn a little later what that actually means, so in the design section of this course. But if we give this now a save, you see that this font here changed completely, right? So now it looks more clean, but what matters is that now as we update our page, in fact, the font family here of this heading now looks very different, right? So it no longer has these serifs, which are like these small things here at the end of the letters. And again, later in the design section, we will then how we can specify specific font families for our pages. But now let's take a look at our next property here for text, which is text transform. And so with text transform, we can basically turn a text uppercase. So you can see one more time that VS Code gives us a lot of suggestions here. So this whole list, and so the most used one here is actually uppercase. So uppercase like this, and the result is exactly what you would expect. So all the text simply turned uppercase. So this is a simple one. And now let's try another one, which is called font style. And here again, you see these options, and the most used one in this case is to set some text to italic. So let's check that out. And indeed, that is just what happened. So the text turned italic as expected. Great. So we already covered 4 properties and some of its possible values here. So we're making good progress. And of course, as I mentioned before, you do not have to start memorizing these properties here now. You will get used to them over time as you start using them more. And let's actually get rid of this one here, because we'll actually talk about colors a little bit later. Okay, so now go to our next headings. So let's now style our H2 element. So that is this basically main heading of this article. And so we can use the properties that we already learned. And so if you keep typing these property names, they will start getting into your brain. So this one, let's actually make it even bigger than the H1. So really big, like 40 pixels. And that's no problem at all. So just because the H1 is the main heading of the page, it doesn't mean that it also needs to be the biggest one. So being the H1 is really all about semantics, not only about what it looks like. So we have a nice big text, and now let's just make it also a sans serif. So giving it this modern look and feel. So sans serif keyword, and here we go. Next up, let's style our paragraphs. And so as I mentioned before, by selecting the P element like this, this will actually select all the P elements that are on our page. So this paragraph here, and this, and really all the ones that we have here on the page. Okay. So let's give it again a font size, let's say of 22 pixels. And for now, all of these length here, so all of these numbers that I've been using are kind of random. But later we will also learn how we can use a system so that we can basically automatically figure out which font sizes we should use. Okay, now I also want to change the font family again. And once again, using sans serif. And nice. That looks very nice already. And if we compare it with our demo, then we can see that we start getting closer to our demo page, what we want to achieve in the end. There is actually just one more thing that I want to change here in the paragraphs, which is to specify yet another new property, which is the line height. So I will first actually specify it, and then you will see the difference in the text. So here we actually use a value without a unit. So in this case, this 1.5 simply means that the line height will be 1.5 times the font size. All right. So by default, the line height is simply 1. But now if we set it to 1.5, then you should see the space between the lines here increase. So between here and here and here. So look closely at that as I now click here to reload the page. And you see that really changed. Right? And we could set it even higher, of course. And then we would get even more space. But that looks already too much. So let's go back to 1.5 like this. Now, by the way, something quite interesting happened here that maybe you noticed. So remember how inside of these paragraphs that we just saw, we have different elements such as this italic text, which is an EM element, remember? So here in this paragraph, for example, we have the EM element, or here in this paragraph, we have the strong element, right? Or down here we have the anchor. So this element right here. And you can see these elements here on the page. So for example, this anchor here somehow got the same font size and the same font family as the P element, even though we did not specify these styles for the link anywhere. So we specify the font size and the family and the line height, not for the anchor, not for strong text, or not for strong elements, and also not for the EM element, right? But still, they got these styles applied to them somehow, right? And the reason for this is a very important mechanism called inheritance. Now, this is a little bit complex to understand, and so we will have a whole lecture on inheritance a little bit later. But still, I wanted to already show you this effect in action here at this point. But Anyway, let's now keep styling or reminding elements. So starting with H3, and let's put that here after the H2 to group our rules here in a logical way. So the font size in this one, let's make it like 30 pixels. So that's going to be this one here, exactly, and this one. So again, we have multiple H3 elements, and so by using the H3 selector here, we will select all of them. Now just the font family again, and setting it to sans serif. All right, and now finally we have the H4 heading. So that's this one here. So let's again set the font size and the font family. So 20 pixels. And here's sans serif. And actually, let's also turn the text uppercase here. So, and remember how we use the text transform property for that. We set it to uppercase like this. Nice. And now there is just one final property that I want to show you to basically style text, which is that we can also align text. So again, a little bit like we can do in Microsoft Word or in Google Pages or something like that. And so for that, we use the text align property. And again, you can see the options here. So one interesting one that we can use is to align the text to the center. And so guess what will happen now when I save it? We need to go down here again. And you see that now it is in the center of the page. And technically it is in the center of its parent element, but that parent element basically occupies this entire page. And so therefore it is now at the center of the page. All right. And so now the only thing that we are missing is these list items here. So all of these 5 and these 3, and also these anchors. So the links. But we will style the links a little bit later because there are some special cases for links. So let's just finish this video by styling these li elements. All right. Let's do that down here. And notice how we do not style the OL element and the UL element that are the parent elements of the list items. Okay. So remember that the list itself is an OL or a UL, but we do actually style the LI elements. Okay, and so again, let's set the font family to thing, so to sans serif actually. Give it a save, and we also want to change the font size one more time. So by default, we get this font size that we see here, which is usually 16 pixels by default. Okay, so that's an important thing that we also need to know a little bit later. So take note of that. But of course, we want to make it a little bit bigger. So we have our paragraphs at 22 pixels. So let's actually make this a little bit smaller. So let's say at 20 pixels. And that's it. Beautiful. So we finished the basic styling of our text of our page, and we learned about 6 new CSS properties along the way. So take some time to review what we just did, and then let's move on to the next lecture, where we will learn a little bit more about selectors. Welcome back. So I've been mentioning Flexbox many times now, but now it's finally time to start using it for the very first time. Now, before I actually explain you what Flexbox actually is and how exactly it works, I want to start by actually using it a little bit in practice. And to learn the very basics of Flexbox, Actually, the context of a project like this is not ideal, and so we will learn it a little bit in isolation. So actually, you need some files now from the starter files of this section. So let's come here, which remember is this folder that I downloaded from GitHub. And then in the starter files for this section, so CSS layouts, grab this flexbox.html and the CSS grid.html and then copy them into the folder that you are currently working in. And so in my case, that is here on the desktop, this one. So let's paste them there and make sure that it really is inside of the folder that you're currently working in VS Code. So otherwise, everything else I show you will not work. And now if we go here to our sidebar, then indeed, here we now have flexbox.html. And so this is kind of a starter file, so we can quickly learn just the very basics of Flexbox in isolation. Okay. So now in order to access them here in our browser, let's actually go back to index.html, which is this page here, right? And then up here in our navigation, maybe you remember that we actually set some links there. So this one that says Flexbox and CSS Grid. And so here I will now actually connect these HTML files. So right now this link points to nowhere, but now I actually wanted to go to flexbox.html. And then the same thing here for CSS Grid. All right. And so now if we come to our page and click on Flexbox, it will go to that flexbox.html file that we specified. So it is still at this URL here, and then /flexbox.html. All right. And so that is, again, this file right here. So here I have some starter code. So basically this container element, which contains these 8 elements in there. And so all of them have a different background color as I defined up here. All right. And so now let's come here to this element called container, and let's start using Flexbox. And it's actually very simple. So all we have to do in order to get started with Flexbox is to use the display property and set it to flex on some container element. And with container element, I simply mean any element that has a couple of child elements. So just like this one. But it could have any other class name here. So we already knew the display property, but now we got a new value. And so again, the one that we want is to set it to flex. So give it a save and let's see what happens. And immediately it looks different, right? So all these elements are now immediately side by side without having to use any floats or anything like that. And these elements here, we call them the flex items because they are the child element of the container. So again, this element here is the flex container, and 8 child elements are the flex items. All right. Now here, each of these elements occupies exactly the space that it needs for its content. And so you see that actually we don't have enough space here. So let's give us actually some more space. So something like this. Or maybe to make it easier, just make the text a little bit smaller. And so now you can see that each of the flex items needs a lot less space. And by the way, this gray space that you see here after the last flex item is simply the background color of the rest of the empty container. So that's this color here. All right. So let's see if we now have enough space. And yeah, that looks nice. Can increase that a little bit more again, even 34. And yeah, so good to go. Now, again, horizontally, each of these elements takes up exactly the space that is necessary for its text content. However, vertically, things are a bit different. So vertically by default, all the flex items are as tall as the tallest element, which in this case has 150 pixels because we set this third one, so the green element, with a height of 150 pixel. And if we change this like to 250, then you would see that all of them grow taller. And if this wasn't present here at all, then in the end, all of them would simply also have the height to occupy only the space that's necessary for the content. But let's actually put this back, because this can be helpful to demonstrate a couple of things. So in order to demonstrate just how powerful Flexbox can be, I'll show you one of its most useful applications, which is vertical centering. So to basically center all these items vertically, all we have to do is to say align items and then simply center. And let's see what happens. And indeed, they are now vertically aligned, just as expected. So the flex container still takes the height of the highest element, which is still this one of 150 pixels. But now all the other ones simply take the space that they need for the text, or in general for the content, and then they get vertically aligned in the center. Let's try another one. So to put them at the very start, we use flex start like this. And to put them at the bottom, we use flex end. All right. And by default, the value of align items is stretch. And so now we will see exactly the result that we had at the beginning. So stretch essentially means that all the element will automatically stretch as tall as the tallest element. All right, but let's actually put it back to center, because this is one of the most important applications of Flexbox. Just imagine how hard it would be to do this without Flexbox. So we would have to manually select all of these elements except the green one, and then kind of try to guess some margin at the top so that they then look aligned in the center. But here it all happens automatically. And of course, we can also center them horizontally. So basically center all of these items inside of the flex container. So we do that with just by content and set it to center. And see that now the space here is the same on this side and on this side. So that means that they are now centered inside of the container. But actually, this property here, so justify content, that is part of the Flexbox specification, gives us a couple of other really helpful and nice options here. So for example, we can also say space between and watch what happens then. So you see that basically the remaining space is now distributed evenly between all of these elements. So basically they have now this space which is the same between all of them. So you see here and here and here, and it's really all the same in all the places. All right. And we will actually go a lot deeper into all of these properties, and there are of course a lot more. But now I just wanted to give you a very quick overview of how we can get started using Flexbox. So maybe and hopefully you start seeing how powerful this is. So now that we know the basics, let's get a high-level overview of all the properties that are part of the Flexbox specification in the next lecture. So I hope you're excited to start learning about CSS Grid. I am for sure, and I actually can't wait to finally show you CSS Grid. And to start learning CSS Grid, the best thing is to once again do that in isolation. So just like we did here with Flexbox, which we no longer need, we also have a starter file for CSS Grid. So this HTML file right here is what we will start using to learn CSS Grid now. And again, we already connected that file here in our navigation of our main page. So here we have csgrid.html. So if we go here to our page and click that, then here is our starter file. So you see, actually, we have two container elements here. So let me show that to you. Yeah. So we have container 1 and container 2. And first one is this one here. So basically with the same 8 HTML elements that we had before. Okay, so don't worry about this one here for now. Let's actually turn this one off for now. And to do that, we can do something that we haven't done before. So let me show you something new. And that is display. And we can set it to none. And with this, it will simply be completely removed from the page. All right. But anyway, let's now get started with CSS Grid here in this container 1. So CSS Grid is right now the most modern way of building layouts, and it's also the most complete one. And in my opinion, it is even the easiest way of building layouts, at least if you use only the fundamentals. And setting up a simple grid takes less than a minute, so let's quickly do that. Now, just like in Flexbox, we have flex containers and flex items. In CSS Grid, we have a grid container and then items. So it's a very similar logic. And so our grid container is, of course, going to be this one here. And so in order to declare that here in our code, we can write display, and now it's not flex, but grid. All right. And that's actually it. So visually, this changes nothing in this case, because now we need to actually define our two-dimensional layout. So basically our columns and our rows. So let's start. So we use the property called grid template columns. And now here we can define as many width values as we want. And then for each of these values, one column will be created. So let's say we write 250 pixels and 250 pixels. So just these two values. And so the code will generate two columns, one with a width of 250 pixels, another one with a width of 150. So let's save this. And indeed, there we go. So we have indeed now columns, and if we inspect this, we can see, of course, that the width are just what we specified there. We need some more space here. So indeed, this one has 150 and this one has 250. And in CSS Grid, if we turn on this visualization, we can actually see a lot of different stuff, but more about that later. So as soon as we start creating some columns, then all the elements will be displayed in columns and rows. And so as many rows will be created as necessary. So let's add some more columns here. Why not? So let's say that we wanted a 4x2 grid. So a grid with 4 columns and 2 lines. So add another one here. And then another one. Let's say this one has only 150. And well, now there's not enough space. So let's, just like before, remove this one here a little bit. And maybe we can change this to just 200. Let's see. Let's decrease this a little bit more. And maybe these can be just 100. And so then this makes everything a bit easier to see. But anyway, what's important to understand here is that these items were now placed in these 4 columns, and then as many rows as necessary are created to accommodate for all the content. So if we had another element here, let's say like this, then of course a new row would be created and the new item would be placed there, and the rest here would simply be left empty. But for now, just for this demo, let's leave it like this. And let's notice something else here, which is that just like in Flexbox, the elements stretch across the entire cell. So basically across the height and the width that we defined for each cell. So each of these areas here between the columns and the rows. And a bit more about these terms actually in the next lecture. But what I was saying is that since this element here has a height of 150, so this green one, then this entire row will have that height. So in order to accommodate for its height, and all of these elements will then stretch as far as they need to basically fill that entire row. So if this did not exist, then the row would simply be the height of this content, which is the reason why this row is in fact only as tall as this cell here, so as this grid item. Okay, so that is at least the default behavior, but of course we also size these rows to make them as tall as we want. So we can size the columns like this, and so of course we can also size the rows. So grid, template, and then, as you might have guessed, rows. And let's say we want the first one to be 300 pixels tall and the second 200 pixel. So the idea is the same as with the columns. So the first row will get this one, the second one will get this height. And so if we save this, this is what it looks like. And now this grid item here, which has that defined height of 150, does not stretch across this entire cell here, while these other grid items fill the entire cell, as we can see here with these colors. Okay, so this is how you create a simple grid. So actually all you need would be the columns, and if you then want to also define the rows, you can do that by giving them an explicit height. Okay. Now, just to finish this lecture, just like in Flexbox, we can also specify a gap in CSS Grid. And actually, this is the only way of defining space between the grid items. So always use gap and never margins. That is simply not going to work. So we can use gap, and this property actually used to be called grid, but they dropped that grid prefix when they also added gap to Flexbox. So now it is simply called gap, but if you for some reason see this somewhere, then just know that this is exactly the same and it will all work in browsers. But anyway, let's define now a gap, let's say 30 pixels, and this will do exactly what we expect. So create some gap between these elements, both between the columns and the rows. Now, what we cannot do in Flexbox, but can do in Grid, is to actually define separate values for the column and for the rows. So let's do that. So then say the column gap should still be 30. So let's remove this one. And then the row gap should be, let's say, double. So 60 pixels. And so if we give this a space now, then you see some additional space has been created here to accommodate for that bigger gap. And so the entire grid has become a bit bigger. And now here we have more space. Okay, and that is the very, very fundamentals of CSS Grid. And I'm sure you can already start seeing the great power of this layout technology. So with just these 5 properties, we created this really complex layout. So even though it doesn't maybe look so complex, it actually is. And back in the day, before Flexbox and CSS Grid, this would have been really a lot more difficult to achieve. So CSS Grid is really powerful, and this is just the surface. And until the rest of this section, we will explore a little bit more about everything we can do with it. Welcome back. And let's start with probably the most important design ingredient of all, which is typography. And this is going to be the lecture with the most rules of all, and so let's get started right away. And we will start this lecture with two concepts that you need to know before learning about typography rules. And the first one is what typography actually is. So according to Wikipedia, typography is the art and technique of arranging type to make written language legible, readable, and also appealing when applied. Or in other words, typography is all about making text beautiful and easy to read. Next, we need to talk about serif and sans serif typefaces. And I already used these terms a little bit before, so serif and sans serif, but now it's time to finally learn what they actually mean. So a serif typeface looks like this. So it has these small details like these tails at the end of the lines, which we call serifs. And so that's why this face is called a serif typeface. And serif typefaces are the more traditional typefaces, and therefore we can use them to create more traditional or classic look interfaces. They also make the design convey trustworthiness for the user, and finally, it's also good for long text, for example, in an article, an online magazine. Now, on the other hand, of course, we have sans serif typefaces. So typefaces which do not have these decorative lines, so the serifs that these serif typefaces have. And sans serif typefaces usually look very clean and simple, and therefore by using them, we can give any interface a very modern look and feel, just like on this example here. So an extremely easy example, but if you just compare the two texts in these two images, you will notice that the text in the first image gives the interface a completely different look and feel, like a completely different feeling and a different vibe in a way. And so that's the power of a serif and a sans serif typeface here in action. Now, in my experience, it's a lot easier to choose a sans serif typeface that fits the vibe and the personality of a design than to choose a serif typeface. So, in other words, for beginners, it's way easier to work with sans serif typefaces. So just keep that in mind once you start building your own designs. And now let's actually start with rules. And the first one is to only use good and popular typefaces and play it safe. And with playing it safe, I mean to not choose any crazy or looking typefaces. That's usually never a good idea. So let me give you a couple of examples of sans serif typefaces. So one very nice one that I like a lot right now is called Inter, which looks like this. And by the way, this typeface and all the other ones that I'm going to show you in this video are available on Google Fonts and Font Squirrel. So these two websites, and especially Google Fonts, is part of our, let's say, design toolbox. So the toolbox is, as the name says, a lot of different tools that we need to use when we want to design for the web. And as we go through this section, we will start filling up our toolbox. All right. And all these different tools, so these different websites and web applications, are linked on my resources page. So you can very easily find all the tools that I mentioned throughout this section right there on my website on my resources page. But anyway, let's now take a look at some more. So this one is OpenSens, then we have Roboto, Montserrat, WorkSens, and Lado. So these are 6 very good sans serif typefaces which you can use without any problem. Now, at first sight, to the untrained eye, these 6 typefaces might actually look almost the same. But believe me, they are really not the same. So if you would apply these 6 different typefaces to your page one by one, you would create like 6 completely different looking websites. But anyway, if you're looking for a serif typeface, then let me show you 6 examples of free serif typefaces. Oh, and I forgot to mention that these 6 sans serif typefaces are actually also all for free, of course, such as basically all the other tools that I listed on my resources page. But now about these serif typefaces. Here they are, so Merriweather, Aleo, Playfair Display, Cormorant, Cardo, and Laura. And again, they probably all look very much the same, but well, they are not the same at all. These are even more different in each other than the sans serif ones that I showed you. Now, many beginner designers think that they need to mix multiple typefaces in order to create a nice looking design. But that's actually not true. So when you're just starting out, it's completely okay to use only one typeface on one page. And if you're really feeling adventurous, then limit your typefaces to 2. If you use more than that, then your design will start looking like amateurish and strange. But now about actually choosing the right typeface for your design, again, you will need to think about your website personality. So choose the right personality for your website, and again, more about this later. So don't stress about the personality for now, but this is still important for this instruction that I'm going to give you. So you choose the personality, then you decide a serif and a sans serif typeface, and then you can experiment with all the good typefaces that I just showed you. And of course, you don't need to limit yourself to these 6. You can of course also experiment with many other typefaces that are available on Google Fonts. So based on this experimentation, you can see which of the typefaces is best to convey the message of your website. And of course, for a beginner, that's not really so simple, but trust me that with experience, this will come naturally to you. Finally, of course, you can also keep trying different typefaces as you design and build a page. So you don't need to really decide for one in the very beginning. You can just start by using one, and then as you're in the middle of your design process, you can just choose another one. And many times this is actually what I do, because when I have more content on the page, it then becomes more obvious and it becomes easier to see which of the typefaces best fits the website's message. Okay, so these are the basic rules on how to choose good typefaces. Now we also need to choose good font sizes and weights. So let's see how. So when you're looking to choose a font size, you should limit your choice to make your life easier. To do that, you can use a type scale tool or another predefined range of font sizes. Because if you do that, then you don't have to constantly think about coming up with font size values. And actually, we will do that in a big course project and even in the project that is in this section. Now, with that being said, let's now talk about some guidelines for actual font size values in different parts of websites. So for normal text, you should use a font size between 16 and 32 pixels. So in this example of this page, for example, the navigation has 16 pixels, and then this smaller text down here is an 18 pixels. All right. And by the way, this is going to be a long list of guidelines like this, and so you should totally print out these slides to make it easier for you to follow them later when you design on your own. But anyway, for a long text format, you can try a font size of 20 pixels or even bigger, because if the user needs to read something like a blog post, it's going to be far easier if the text is a little bit bigger. So for example, this text down here in the example, which describes this section, has 80 pixels text. Also, this text up here, which kind of describes the company, has 24 pixels, and this text below has 32, which we can kind of actually as normal text. So again, it is in the range of rule 5, so between 16 and 32 pixels. And of course, this is just one small example amongst thousands and thousands of web designs, but I just want you to get a sense for the kind of values that we can use in designs. But anyway, for big headlines, you can actually go really big with your font sizes, like even more than 50 pixels, and you can also make them really bold, like more than 600. And we didn't learn about these bold values yet, but we will, maybe in the next lecture or maybe in our big course project. So the headline of this design has a font size of 85 pixels, and it is also really bold with a boldness of 700. Also, this other, a bit smaller headline down here has 64 pixels of size and is still really bold at 700. Oh, and then we also have 42 pixels here in this testimonial text. Now, the final rule about using good font sizes and weights is to use a font weight that is under 400. So if you go below 400, that would be light or really light text, and that is then hard to read. So just don't go below 400, which is basically a regular font weight. Now next up, let's learn a couple of guidelines and rules to create a good reading experience for your users, which, remember, is one of the aspects of typography. Remember? So to start, you should try to use less than 75 characters per line, like in this example here. So these lines here have something between 65 and 72 characters, which makes this text really easy to read. However, if you break this rule, you might end up creating something like this, which is really hard to read for your eyes. So here the lines have between 95 and 112 characters, and if you actually try to read this, you will find it a bit difficult to follow such a long line. Next, for a text with normal size, try to use a line height between 1.5 and 2. Now, if the text is really big, like a headline, you can go below 1.5, and actually you can go really low, something like 1.1 or 1.2. So a good rule of thumb that you keep in mind is that the smaller or the longer the text is, the larger the line height needs to be. So here we have some good readable examples with the big headline having only 1.2. As the text gets smaller, we have 1.31, and then the long text has 1.5. Now, if you use an oversized line height like this, then your text again becomes hard to read. So we're creating a bad reading experience for your users because these lines look kind of detached. And so then our eyes have difficulty going from one line to the next one as we read the text. Now, another nice and very rule that can make a lot of difference is that if your headline kind of looks unnatural, you can try to decrease the letter spacing. Now, what unnatural actually means will of course come from experience, but I'm going to show you a couple of examples right now and also through the rest of the course. So in this headline, for example, we have a letter spacing of minus 3.5 pixels. And if you ask me, this looks quite nice and quite natural. While on the other hand, if it was just 0 pixels, so basically without us defining any letter spacing, then the letters would look kind of detached from one another. Next, another thing that you can try, and which is actually very popular among designers, is to use all caps for short titles. Now, if you do this, then you also make this title quite small and also bold and increase the letter spacing, just like this interface here does. So basically we have one main heading here, and we have kind of a subtitle which describes that heading, and that is the one that uses caps and bold and big letter spacing. And without doing all that, it would simply look like this, which, if you ask me, is a little bit more boring. Okay, and we're almost reaching the end here, so just hang in there. So usually on the web, we do never justify text. So it's somehow just a convention that basically no website ever justifies their text. And so you should also follow that convention. So not centering text looks like this, which is exactly what we're used when we read some blog posts, for example, on the web. While on the other hand, I bet you're not used to see text like this on the web, right? And so therefore, if you were to design a page like this, that would then look quite unnatural. Now also about aligning text, you should usually not center text unless we are talking about really small text blocks. So you can just leave text like this aligned to the left and not like this in the center. Because once again, this actually makes it a lot harder to read the text when you need to jump from one line to the next one. Okay, so that's it about guidelines and rules for typography. Now, of course, there are many rules here, and we cannot always follow all of them in all designs. And so that's why they are more like guidelines and not really strict and hard rules. Okay. Now, something that I didn't mention here is that we also need to be careful about the color of our text. But actually, we will leave that for the next lecture when we talk all about colors. But now let's actually go ahead and implement some of these guidelines in practice in the project of this section. So I hope to see you there soon. All right, let's now have some more fun by building another component. And so in this lecture and the next one, we're going to build a carousel component. And just like with the last one, I chose one of the components, so one of the carousels that we saw before in the component gallery. So in case this blue carousel here that I thought would be fun to recreate together with you now over these two lectures. So as I just showed you before, this is what our final carousel will look like. And if you ask me, this looks really, really cool. So we have this image here basically floating on top of well, this background here. And then we have these two buttons here, also with the shadow, which make them look as if they float a little bit all on top of this background. And then we even have these 4 dots here in the bottom. So this is going to be a lot of fun to code. So let's get started. Now here we have this code from the previous lecture. And actually I'm going to copy all of it. And then I will just delete what we don't need, because we will once again use these same colors. So basically a similar design style. So another HTML file, and this one is called 02 and then carousel.html. Close down this one. And so now let's start by removing all the HTML except for the body, of course. So like this. And then also most of the styles except for the global and the body. So just like this. So we also want to keep the font. And so here is just the title. And actually, I will now copy everything again. So basically this empty state here, and create yet another file. And so then based on that, we will be able to create our next components. So then we don't have to do this all the time. So just some name here. It doesn't really matter. And okay. So this one will be a carousel component. And so now let's get started with writing some HTML. Now here we need some space because this one is actually a bit wider, but that's no problem. We have enough space here. Okay. And then I will use a non-semantic div element, which this time is simply called carousel. So just like before, it was called the accordion. And let's get straight into the content. And the first piece of content is the image. So we need to specify the source attribute. And now this image here is this maria.jpg. So this was actually one of the starter files for this section. And now here as the alt text, I will actually use her name, which is in Portuguese, Maria de Almeida. Okay, we can close that here. And now here for this testimonial, we will use, just like before, the block quote element. So this is a common way of marking up a testimonial. So block quote. And so that is going to be basically this entire block of text. And then in there, we can put some paragraphs. So let's give this one here, let's say testimonial text. Testimonial text. And actually, we didn't put any class on the block quote. Let's just copy this one and get rid of the text. So this is called a testimonial. And then in there, we will have like the text and the author, for example. So here again, we will use our blind text generator, which is just lorem. This is a bit too much. I don't know yet. Maybe like this. Oh, and here we want like these quotes, which we could make a little bit more beautiful, but let's keep it simple at this point. Then here, another one for the author. So testimonial author. And then again, her name. And finally, this can be the job. So we're using the job also here along with the person's name, simply because in that example that I'm copying, they also had that. And if you take a look at some pages, then this will actually be pretty common. At EDP Comercial, which is something that you know if you live in Portugal. Okay, and I think, well, let's actually also add the buttons for now. So these two here at least. So let's put them outside of the block, obviously, and here at the very bottom. And you will understand a bit later why I'm not putting like the first button here first, because it appears first, and the second later, because it is the last element here. So I'm putting both here at the bottom, okay? So button, and well, let's simply call it button to keep it simple. And now in here, we want another icon. So this time, this icon here. And so we can get that again. This time it's the chevron left. So copy it and paste that here. So let's call that the button icon. All right. And then another one for the other direction. Well, actually, we need then, of course, also this other icon. So copy SVG and replace this SVG with the new one. So here again, button icon. So give it a save. And now when we go back here to our live connection, which is of course still live, there's no need to reset. Okay, so of course it is still alive because we never stopped it. And this is also still the same project folder. So what we can do here is to delete all of this here. And since we don't have any index.html file, it will not open that index.html file. So if we had, then index.html is by default the page to be opened. But if we don't, then it will show us this directory. And so here is basically all the files that we have in our folder. So before we had this one, so if we clicked, we would get back there. But of course, now we want to check out this one. So we can click here, and this is what we have. All right. Now the image does, as always, by default, take all the space that it can. And so many times that is the first thing that we fix, because like this, it is completely unusable. And actually the image doesn't have any class. But well, it is the only image that we have here, so let's just keep it like that. And the height that I have for this image is 200 pixels. And since we didn't specify the height actually in our HTML, then the width will be set automatically in order to keep the same proportion. Okay, so that is at least fixed now. And so let's add some styles for the carousel itself. So remember that the background color of this element is that green color. So by now you know that is the background color property. We haven't used our green yet. So copying that here. Nice. And what we also want to set first actually is a width. So this one has a width of 800 pixels, which is why it doesn't fit into that smaller window that we had before. And now let's center it again with the margin something and then auto trick. So let's again specify 100 top bottom, and then as always left and right automatically set. Okay, and so now this has the exact same dimensions as our original. Then let's give it also some border radius. Here I'm going with 8 pixels, which again is one of the values in our spacing system. So could have gone with 12, but the 8 is more similar with the original one. All right. And let's also set the color here. So if we set the text color here, then as always, it will get inherited to all the other text elements. Just like this. Then since we have this border radius here, let's also set it on the image. Okay. And I'm still missing here some padding inside of this container. So that's why it still looks pretty bad. So padding, and we will start with 32, but we will fix this later. All right, now let's actually style here the text and the author job. And again, I'm pressing Alt or Option to select all of them at the same time. So copying and pasting. So maybe you're noticing that just like before, I'm starting to basically create the visual styles on all of these elements, right? So I style them first visually, and then after that, we take care of the layout. Now I don't always do it like that, but for a small component like this, many times it's a nice idea. Especially if layout is a bit more tricky, like in this example. So here let's use a font size of 8 pixels. All right. And also let's make it a little bit bolder, because this is the most important content. So we can give it some nice visual hierarchy here. And the line height, of course, needs to be changed from 1 with default to 1.5. Okay. Then here let's use 14 pixels, and in this other one, 12. All right. And now, of course, we need some spacing here. So 4 pixels in this one, and here, of course, a lot after the text. Like this. And this will look better here in a minute once this is all side by side. But actually, I want to do something which we did before, which is to improve the visual hierarchy between the text by using that green color here in this text. So let me get those colors actually from here. So this style CSS, remember, is the one on the project from the previous section. And so in the text, I want to use this color. All right, so that changed ever so slightly. And then here, let's just copy this entire line. Okay. Beautiful. And the same thing here. And now actually this one here doesn't make any sense anymore, because we overrode it in all three places here. All right. Now actually let's put these here side by side, because it still looks very unfinished. So how can we do that? Well, it shouldn't be too hard, because in this carousel, as right now, there are only, well, actually right now there are 4 children. So there's the image, the block quote, and these 2 buttons. But let's actually still do it so that we can then a bit later fix it. So display, flex, so they are side by side. And then of course, as we many times do, let's center all of these elements vertically. So align items center. So after all these times, you probably already know this by heart, I'm pretty sure. And now let's add some gap, which we will change later. But for now, I'm going to use the same 32 pixels. Okay, nice. So this already looks like something, actually, but we are still some way away from this, right? And actually, let's start here by making the image finally this big. So basically, going out of this element. So it looks like it is floating above, and that's even becoming more prominent with this shadow that we added to the image. How do you think we can do that? Well, actually, we never did anything like this, so that would be a hard question. And so instead, let me actually show you. So there's no absolute positioning in this case, or nothing weird going on. Instead, what we do is that we can simply scale this image. So right now it is this small, but again, we can scale it. And so for that, we will learn about a brand new property, which is called transform. So transform is for many different things, and one of them is to scale elements. So we can use scale, and so here we use something called a function. So it's a scale function, and so here now we need to specify parentheses, and then the value by which we want to scale. So if we write 1, then the element will stay the same size. If we use 2, then it will double the size. So like this. Okay? But in this case, let's try 1.5. And so that actually looks quite right, at least here vertically. So the space that it has right here now looks just right. Okay. Now, of course, we need to move it a little bit more to the right. And the position that the image has basically to the right is defined right now by the padding that is on the left. Right? So let me show you that by inspecting. And here actually it becomes nicely visible what happened. So you see there that original square. Well, if we click here, then we can see it. So this is what the image was like in the beginning, right? Just like this. But then by scaling it up, of course, it then overflows basically the original image and grows this large. So if we take that off, we can see it very nicely. So this is what it was before. And again, the position here is kind of defined by the padding. And so we can increase that padding like a lot. And so then once we scale the image, it will no longer be outside, basically here on the left side. Because remember that we want it like this. So we still want the green part to be visible here. So what we can do is to give it some padding to the left here. So increase the padding, which is 32 on all sides. But again, on this side, we want it to be more. So let's see what values we have here. And let's go with 86. Okay, 86 pixels. And there we go. So now if we take a look at that, like this, then the image used to be here. But then, of course, with the scaling, it now looks different. So it ends right here now. So of course we now also need to increase the gap because the image is also overlaying this text. So let's try to go also with 86 and see if that is enough. And well, it looks kind of the same here and here, doesn't it? Maybe it's a bit more here from the eye, but I'm not really sure. And so I will just keep it like this. All right. However, now we have a problem, which is the fact that there was a lot of space created here also in these other gaps, because we still have the buttons here, basically also as flex items where we don't want them to be. So these should not be flex items, but instead they are going to be absolutely positioned. All right, but that we will do in the next lecture. And so to just very quickly finish this one, I will just add the shadow that is still missing here from the image. All right, so let's add that here. So box shadow. And so again, horizontally, we don't want any offset. Then here, let's say vertically 12 pixels, then a blur of 24. And of course, you will have to experiment with these values here in order to gain some experience. So RGBA, remember? And then black, which is usually my go-to, with some alpha value. Let's try 0.1 as always. And well, in order to really see it, we would need to remove these buttons. So let's do that. And again, many times I do these kinds of experimentations right in the browser using the DevTools. So I will just delete it here and delete it as well, simply by hitting the backspace, so the delete button on the keyboard. And so now the shadow is nicely visible, but it is not big enough, or actually not dark enough. So we can keep going here by using our keys. So that's maybe a bit too much. Well, let's leave it at 25%. Now, syntax here is actually a little bit different. So it's not like RGBA, but don't worry about that. All right. So let's just set it here to 0.25, which is essentially 25%. Okay, so that is fixed. Of course, the buttons are back, but never mind about them, because we will now fix that actually in the next lecture. So after a break, I see you back here. Okay, so let's keep working on our carousel. And I'm going to start by actually nicely formatting these buttons here, just so that they look like these two here. All right, so basically making them white and round and the icon green and giving it some shadow. So let's have that here. Let's add some comment here, like the controls. And so we want our button here. So first of all, the background color was, remember, white. Okay. And then since this is actually a button, it has by default a border that we need to remove. So that's a problem we run into before. And so the trick is always to set border to none. And so then it actually disappears completely. But let's set that back. So here we can simply define some height and some width. Let's say 40. I think that's part of our list here. Well, actually not. But let's cheat here in this case and use the value that's between 32 and 48. So we need to do that it looks more like the actual example, and with 40 pixels as well. So there we go, and finally we can see actually the icons now as well, but they are very small, so we need to change that. And here they are called button icon. So button icon, and again we will go with the height and width of 24 pixels. And there we go. Nice. Now, the fact that they are actually not squared, so basically that the width property is not being respected, is the fact that they are right now flex items. And so remember, the width works a little bit differently there. So right now, the browser is trying to fit all this content here into the Flex container, and so it will automatically shrink these items here, even though we set a width of 40 pixels. So if we actually want to see the real result, we should now take them out of this Flex container. And the way in which we will do that is by actually positioning them absolutely. All right, so I will show you a little bit later why we do it that way. But for now, let's just do that. So position, absolute. And so remember, by doing that, we take the element completely out of the flow of the page, right? So for the surrounding elements, it is as if the elements were no longer on the page. And so then basically only these two elements here remain as flex items. All right, so that's very important to remember about absolute positioning. And another thing that's very important to remember is that we specify inside of which container these elements should actually be absolutely positioned. So in relation to what parent the absolute positioning is going to happen. And remember that we need to basically choose a parent element and set that to position relative. All right. So in this case, that is pretty obvious, right? So the element that should be the parent of these two here is this entire carousel. So it is inside of that we want the absolute positioning to happen. So we need to do this, even though it is, of course, already the parent, but we still need to do this. Okay, let's see what happens now. And there we go. So now they are finally back to being squared, even though they are, of course, still not exactly in the position where we want them to be. But we will worry about that later. For now, let's finish formatting them. And so we want them to be round, and therefore, let's use a border radius with a really high value. Or actually, since they are squared, remember we can simply say 50%, and that will then make them round as well. Then here we want actually this to have a color. So this icon, again, we use the stroke property. All right, and there we go. And then it looks as if this icon here is not really centered inside the button, but we can actually fix that quite easily because this element here is a child element. And so we can actually use this nice trick of simply setting this to a flex container and then align items to center it horizontally or actually vertically and justify items or justify content, of course, and center as well. And so now that is nicely centered. So as we saw here, Flexbox is even very helpful when there is only one flex element. So one flex item. So right, so in the button, of course, there is only one element. But still, in order to vertically center that, easiest way is to declare the parent element as a flex container and then center it both horizontally and vertically like this. All right, but now it's the time where we actually want to position these two elements. So this one here should go to the right and then a little bit outside of it, and the other one to the left, right? So actually we need two different classes for each item, so we can position them separately. So this one is, this is one button. So let's give it here simply another class. So a variation of button, which is button left. That's why I like to use these two just there. And then button right, like this. Okay. Actually, let's do it after the real button. So let's start by saying left 0, and then on the other one we say right 0. Okay, so that looks good already. And for some reason they're already vertically centered, but let's pretend they are not. Okay, so probably that is because of this flex container. Let's see. So they are still in a way flex items, even though they are absolutely positioned. And so if we no longer would align these items vertically, then you see that they would actually also move to another position. So for now, as we implement the technique that I'll show you next, let's leave it like this. All right. So let's go back to these buttons, because now I'm going to explain you and to show you a brand new technique that we use in CSS all the time, actually. And so this one has to be with absolute positioning and also kind of with centering at the same time. So to start, let's go back here to see what we actually want, which is these two buttons here to be exactly vertically centered, and even more importantly, also exactly centered here, basically on this line. So on this transition. All right. So how can we do that? And let's actually first focus on the vertical centering using absolute positioning. Okay. So we might think that we could vertically center this element simply by setting the position here to 50%. So actually the top. So here in the top property, remember that we can specify the distance basically from the top. And so we can do also that in percentages. So for example, we could specify 10%, and then that would look like this. However, we can also specify 50%. And so as I was just saying, we might think that since 50% is like half of 100%, that this might then vertically center this element. So let's take a look. And well, it kind of does, but it also doesn't. And the reason for that is that basically 50% is exactly half of the width of the parent container. And so that's from here to here. But that is only the start of the element. So the element is right here, but basically we would like the center of the element to be here in the center, right? But that probably sounds a bit confusing. So let me actually show you now a visual representation of this technique. So this is our starting position where we have the carousel with the position set to relative and the button left with the position set to absolute, right? And so now, as we just did, we set the position to 50%. And so what that does is to move this element by exactly 50% of the parent's container's height. All right. So for example, if the carousel had a height of 600 pixels, then this button would have moved down 300 pixels. So exactly 50% of the parent's container. And this is really important. Okay. However, as we see here, what it did was to basically move the top of the element exactly to the middle, but not the element itself. And so that's where the second part of this technique comes in. So technique of vertically centering with absolute positioning. And so that second part is by using the transform property once again. Now, in this case, we use transform not with scale, but with translating. And what translate does is to basically move the element around. Now, here we can specify the x value, which is basically horizontally, and the y value, which is the second one. And so that is vertically. And in this example, I set that to minus 50%. And why minus 50? Well, because that will basically move the element exactly 50% of its height back to the top. And again, these 50% here in the transform property are actually 50% of the actual element's height, so not of the parent container's height. And that is completely different. Okay? And so the result of doing this is that now the element will be exactly centered vertically. So again, the translate property takes two values, where the first one is basically horizontally and the second one is vertically. And so by specifying minus 50% means that the element will move up because of the minus, and it will move up by exactly 50% of its actual height. And so by doing this, after the second step, it will be completely centered vertically. All right. So I hope that made sense, especially with this animation, and maybe we can play that in. So we start here, which will move the element down here. So again, 50% of the parent container's height. Then we add the translate, as I just explained, which will move it back 50%. Okay? And so let's now go back to code and actually implement this. Okay, so here we are back, and actually let's put this here in the button left so that we don't get too confused. Okay, so that looks the same, but now let's go back to our transform property. So transform, and remember, now we don't use scale like we did before, but we use translate. And here we set the first one to 0 by now, which is horizontally, and then vertically we want minus 50% for the reasons that I just explained to you. And so take a look at this button now, and there we go. Now it is vertically centered using this absolute positioning technique. Great, so that's beautiful, but you might be wondering why we didn't simply use the power of Flexbox for this. And the reason is that, well, we actually don't want this to be a flex element. That's the first thing. The second thing is that sometimes we actually want to position an element absolutely like this, and then it is important that you know this technique. And third is because actually we want to use translate also horizontally, right? Because in this case, if we simply used Flexbox, then actually this wouldn't work. First, because remember, it created all those extra gaps for all of these elements that we did not want. And then also because it would be impossible to place these elements basically outside of the container, which is exactly what we're going to do now, right? So what I mean here is that this translate, of course, is not only vertically, but also horizontally. So we can specify a value here. So let's experiment first with some other value, let's say 10 pixels, just so you see how it works. And so what happens is that it moved 10 pixels to the side, right? But what if we set it to 50%? Well, then basically it will move half of its own width to the right side. So that's almost what we want, but we want it to move to the left side, right? So we say minus 50%, and there you go. Now it is exactly where we want it to be. So right in the center here, basically vertically centered with this border here. So this end of the element. And to make that even more visible, let's add some box shadow here. Okay, so vertically 12 pixels. Then let's blur it 24. And once again, I'm just using this here very quickly. And with experience, this will become easier for you. All right. And so now we can see that beautifully, right? It is really exactly at the center. Now, we could, of course, also have done it completely without the transform. So if we did this, of course, it would look like this. And we could then try to guess these values here kind of manually. But the problem is that, again, these top and left values are not in relation to the element itself, but to the parent element. So that is really one of the main takeaways of this lecture. So in relation to parent element, so I'm actually writing that down here for you, and this is in relation to element itself. And so here we could now like say minus 125 pixels or something. And in this case, we will actually know the width of these elements. So we could have said like minus 20 pixels, and then that would have worked. But usually that is actually not the case. So that is oversimplifying it. So usually we would have to mess here manually with some pixels or even with some percentage, which is even worse, like 3%, for example. And then that is too much. So we would try 2%, which is not enough. And so, yeah, this is not a good idea. It is better to put these to some default like 0 and 50, and then use this. All right. Then here we need the same transform in the button right, but in the opposite direction. So of course we need this top here as well. So let's put that, well, let's copy it just so it's a bit easier for you to understand. But we could also have simply put it here into the button, which is the class that both of them have in common. But anyway, now it looks like this. And so in this case, we actually want it to move to the right. And so here, this value needs to be positive. Okay, and there it is. So we have our buttons here completely positioned in the exact position where we wanted them to be. And so once again, that is a perfect use case for absolute positioning. Now let's turn this back on. So to put the text back to where it was. And also we need some, we want the cursor here to be a mouse on these buttons. So that's something I forgot. And it's a trick that we already used before. So cursor set to pointer. All right. So that looks almost the same. It is a little bit different, but that's, well, because we used some different values. But what matters is that we are still missing these dots here. So these are basically also buttons, and they are located also outside of this container. All right. So if it's outside of its own container, that looks again as if we will need some absolute positioning here, right? And so let's go ahead and now code this part very quickly. So right here at the very end, where these controls start, let's add some container element, let's say some div, which I'm going to call the dots. And then let's put 4 button elements in there. So for these 4 elements. So the button with a class of dot. And now what should we put in here? Well, we can simply leave it empty, but usually it's a better practice to create an empty space. So something that looks like this, but remember that HTML actually ignores empty spaces like this. So instead of creating an empty space like this, it is a common technique to use an HTML entity for that. And that entity, so that entity that represents the empty space, is NBSP, like this. So you see it here, it's a non-breaking space. That's what NBSP means. All right, so again, that's just in order to not leave this button completely empty, which is not a good idea usually. Okay, copy it 4 times, and then we need dot and dot. Okay, and let's start with these, giving it some height and some width. And the visual styling here is not really important. For me, what matters most at this point is more like the stuff about laying out the elements. So again, since this is a button, we need to reset the background color or set it to something. So let's set it to white. Then it looks like we have some border going on here, right? So border, and that is a 2-pixel border, solid and or green. Okay, let's check that out. And it is. Now we cannot really see the border because it is green. And this whole dots element is of course now yet another flex item because we didn't yet position it absolutely. But let's do that a bit later and continue styling the dots. So here, let's also make them round with a border radius of 50% and give it the cursor like this. Okay. All right. And now we need to also put them side by side, I guess. All right. So for that, well, actually, let's first position them absolutely. So position absolute. Okay, there they are. And now, of course, we want them to be in the center. So right here, and then at the bottom for now. And so we will now again use the exact same technique that we used before, only it being horizontally this time. But the technique itself works in the exact same way. So what I just explained to you before in that slide. So this time, instead of setting the top to 50%, I will set the left to 50%. So left, 50%. And so that will move basically the start of the element right to the middle of the parent container. Because again, top and left use the dimensions of the parent element as the reference. Okay, but now we use transform and then translate. And now the first value is the horizontal one. And so we move it back 50%, which remember is in relation to itself. All right. And so now it's in the center. Nice. Let's also put it at the very bottom. Bottom 0. There we go. And now let's move it down. And so for that, I really like to use the transform property. So again, I like to put these here like to 0 or to 50% or some really round value like that. And then here we can use translate to position it exactly where we want. So let's say 32 pixels, which is one of our values. And yeah, that looks nice. And so now let's actually put some space between them. And to do that, I will make this a flex container and declare some gap on it. Okay. And if this is all going a little bit too fast for you, especially the constant use of the flex property, then of course feel 100% free to maybe review that part. So maybe the part about Flexbox. But anyway, let's now define some quick gap here. 12 pixels. All right, beautiful. And with this, we might be, well, almost done. So the first one here still needs to be green. So let's give the first one a special class. So maybe that's a trend that you are starting to see. So that we have one class for everything. And then we have specialized classes, which give some of them basically some additional power. And in this case, that additional power will be that green background color. There we go. And that looks basically the same. Just again, some spacing that's different. The content is all different. But besides that, oh, here we actually need to fix a bit the padding. And I think that's something I mentioned in the beginning. So let's do that. And also that's an opportunity actually to show you something else. So here, of course, we could simply write padding to the right should be like 48 pixels. So that's better. Let's just remove that last word there. I don't like the way that looks. Even this one maybe. Cool. Yeah, but anyway, going back here, this of course works because we set the general padding to 32, then we override the padding on the left to 86, and then we override the padding to the right to 84. However, we can set that all in one go. So remember how the padding property has a shorthand which allows us to set the top and bottom in the first value and the left and right in the second value, right? So like this. So this would be top and bottom, and this left and right. However, we can also take that further. So we can specify 4 values, and those 4 values will then be top, right, bottom, and left. So basically clockwise starting at the top. So let me take out all of this and replace it with just one declaration. Again, it starts at the top and then goes clockwise around the 4 borders, basically, the 4 sides of the box. So in the top, we want 32 pixels. On the right, we want 48 pixels. In the bottom, 32 pixels, and left, 48. Give it a save, and that is wrong because on the left, it is 86. So this one here. And so now it is correct. And so now we did actually finish this small project. It was a bit bigger than I thought it would be, but still, I think it was fun and the final result looks fantastic. And we did learn a lot of things here. Actually starting with this. So this is something new. Then we learned how to scale an image. And then finally, we learned this very important technique where we could an element anywhere that we wanted by using a combination of absolute position and transform with translate. So maybe experiment a little bit with the transform property with the translate function. So try different values here for horizontal and vertical placement, and yeah, that will then help you solidify this knowledge. And then I see you back here for our next component, which is going to be a table. And I promise that's going to be a little bit simpler. Welcome back to the next lecture, where we will now finally start building our OmniFoot project. And we're going to start with the hero section. And for that, I already created this sketch here. So as I mentioned before, we will create this layout where we have the hero image on the right side, and then the content such as the line and some description on the left side. So exactly like these 2 examples that I've selected from our layout gallery lecture. Now on top of this section is kind of this logo and the navigation bar, but this is something that we will do a bit later. So it's actually not part of the hero itself, but it's kind of part of the start, so of the beginning of the website. And so that's why I put it here as well. Now also, we will add this small component that I have highlighted in red here in the bottom, which is these customer photos and then with some relevant data. So that was not in the sketch before, but now here I have it, and you will see that it makes sense with the content that we have. Okay, and so now let's actually start building this hero section in VS Code. And let's start by removing what we did previously. Okay, and now I want to show you a very nice and important trick, which basically will allow us to have the HTML and the CSS file opened at the same time, side by side. So to do that, I will open again the CSS file, and then I can click here on this icon. So this one that says split editor right. Now, if you cannot see it, you can also do the same thing here in view and then editor layout. So you can then choose one of these options here, but usually I just click here, and then that will open this exact same file here on the right side. Okay, then I can close it here, and then to give ourselves some more space, we close down the sidebar, and that's it. So Here we usually need more space for the HTML. And yeah, I think that's perfect. And so now we can basically work on both files at the same time. All right, but now about our actual hero section here. Let's indeed use a section element, which basically represents a generic part of any document. So let's use section here and give it the class of section hero. So I usually like to give all my sections then a class name, which also starts with section. That then makes it easy to identify, right? So we talked about section, so the section element before, and it is a little bit similar to the article element, but the article is more self-contained, basically. So for a section to exist, there should usually be multiple sections, which are then part of something bigger, all right? So let's move that in later. For now, let's actually keep going. And so now I want to create the two boxes, which will then contain on the right side the image and on the left the text content. So let's create a div element for that, which remember is simply like a box, which has no semantic meaning at all. So I'm going to call this one the hero text box. And that is the one that will contain, among other elements, this h1 here. And then we also want the hero image box. So hero image box, and then we can immediately actually put the image in here. So that is in the folder img, then slash, and then it is our hero image. And you see that it worked because it's already right here. Okay, but now let's keep going and add some more content here. So our content, of course, is here in the MD file. So this is the one that we already have, so the headline. And then here is this summary, basically. So let's just copy all this text. Then I'm going to call this one the hero description. And there we go. Here let's also add a class for heading primary. Okay, because then later we will have some classes also for the secondary and the tertiary headings. So the H2 and the H3 elements. And of course, we could simply select the H1 using this H1 element select, right? But actually, I like to always select all the elements using class. So no ID selectors and no element selectors. Everything will always be selected using classes because that will give our CSS code a lot more consistency. Okay, so we have the heading, then we have the description, and now we also want two buttons here below this. So just like in that layout pattern example that we saw at the beginning of this lecture. And for that, I'm actually going to use an anchor element. So a link, basically, because links are for going somewhere on the page or going to some other page, while a button element should only be used for actions. So if something happens that is not related to navigation, basically. So here for now, we will create an empty link. Okay. And then let's see if in the content we have some text to put on the button, but actually there is nothing. And so these types of small text, so just a small piece of text, we usually call microcopy. And many times we have to come up with those as we design and build the websites ourselves. Now this button here is going to be the main call to action button of this page. And so let's now think what we could write there. So the main action that we want the user to take here is to basically subscribe to the OmniFoot subscription. Right. And so here we should write something related to that. And since the focus of this company is all on like healthy eating and things like that, we can simply write here, start eating well, for example. Okay. And it could be, of course, anything similar, but it should be like a specific action. So it wouldn't be really helpful to just write here, sign up now or buy now or something like that. So that doesn't sound so nice. And so instead, we want a very specific action like this, which makes the user feel better immediately. So start eating well, I think, is a lot more compelling than like sign now or subscribe now. Right? Then here just adding the button class. And now, besides that, we want another button, which is usually like a secondary button, which is going to be a secondary button. And this is usually used for something like getting additional information. So a popular text here is simply learn more. And then we can add some arrow here as well. So using an HTML entity, and we used R, and then I think this here, which is the right arrow. Yeah, you can see it there in the tooltip. But then we also have DR, which stands for down arrow. And again, it's visible now there in the tooltip. And so this makes a bit more sense in this case. Okay, and with this, I think we are ready to check what we have already. And as always, the image is really big. And so remember that we need to make it flexible now. So that's one of the ingredients of responsive web design. Remember that? Then here's also the rest of the content. And so let's now start styling this a little bit, and actually starting with the layout. So putting these two boxes here side by side. So one with the image and one with this text. Okay. Now for doing this, I'm actually going to use CSS Grid, even though it's actually more like a one-dimensional layout. So it's really just a row, but I'm still going to use CSS Grid because it makes it really easy to have equally sized columns. And also because I like to use the same tool for layout across the entire page. And later, of course, we are going to use CSS Grid for some other layout stuff. And then, yeah, as I said, I like to just use the same thing everywhere. All right. But even if we used Flexbox instead of CSS Grid, we would still need some container element for these two boxes. So the image box and the text box, right? So that grid container could, of course, be this section hero here, right? But then if we were to choose this one, a container, then we couldn't create a fixed sized container like we want to. Okay, so let's actually create another element here. So one that I'm going to call a hero. And this doesn't make a lot of sense right now. It will make sense in a minute once you actually see what I'm talking about. Okay. Oh, again, this hero here will actually be our CSS Grid container. So let's select that. And now you can see how handy it is to have these two here side by side, right? So display grid. And now, as I said, we will make two equally sized columns. So grid template columns, remember. And so here we just need to give them same value. And so usually that's 1 FR and then another 1 FR. So 2 fractional units right there. And so with this, they should not be side by side. And indeed they are, but they do not have the same size, right? And the reason for that is this huge image, which is still not really flexible. So before we do anything else, let's actually fix that. And so here, let's give it a class name. So it's the hero image. Oh, and actually we need to add the alt text as well. So never forget to do that. And so here, let's say that it's a woman enjoying food, but that's not all. There's also meals in storage container and footballs on a table. So a really descriptive alt text here, but that's really nice for people who cannot see these images, or also remember for search engines. Yeah, and now selecting the image with the class we just gave it. All we have to do now is to give it a width of exactly 100%, because 100% will then fill the entire parent element, which is this hero image box here, which is exactly one of the two columns of the grid. And so that column will have half the size of the grid container, and so then the image, of course, will also have half the width of the container now. Okay, and if we resize this here, then you see that indeed the image does resize as well, and so it is already at this point a flexible image. Okay, but now I'll actually do what I mentioned to be the reason why we need this hero element here, which is to get a fixed width. Right. So remember that we used to use the width property for that, and I'm going to give it 1300 pixels. But remember from the last lecture that we'll no longer use pixels now, right? And remember what instead we use? Well, we use the rem unit, which before we set one rem here to being exactly 10 pixels, right? And so here we do not want 1300 pixels, but we want 130 rem, right? So that's one thing that we needed to fix here. And the other one is actually this width property. Because what happens like this, and let's actually give it some background color here. So just a random color here. And so now let's decrease this a little bit. And well, just as I mentioned in the last lecture, now, of course, this element does not adjust to the viewport, so to its parent element. And so therefore, we then create these vertical scroll bars, which is, of course, not what we envision for a real-world website. And so indeed, what we want is max width, right? And so now, when the element is larger than the container, it will simply occupy 100% of it. And so you see that this starts to look quite, right? So quite real world, at least. And so then when it becomes larger than the specified width, then it simply stays here. Okay. Let's get rid of this. And then, of course, we also want to center it in the viewport. And for that, we're actually going to use our old trick of 0 auto. Okay. And so this is starting to look like a usable layout that we can now improve upon. And so let's do that next and take a small break. Let's now start adding some more visual styles to our hero section. And let's start by styling the text. So our primary heading here and our hero description. So just copying that. Let's put it here. And for now, I'm simply putting all the styles here one after another. So first of all, let's select a font size. And so let's go to our list of options. And let's try to go maybe with this 61 here. So 61 pixels, which remember means 6.2 rem. And so again, we will now use the rem unit to really size everything on our page. So all the length, like this one here, and all the font sizes as well. Okay, then let's make it bold by giving it a font weight of 700. And then let's check it out here. And that looks huge. So that's probably a bit too big. And there's also a bit too much space between the lines here. So we used 62 pixels. So let's go one down to 52. So 5.2 rem. And then the line height, let's set it to 1.1. Okay. So that looks a little bit better. And well, let's increase it actually even more to 1.05. And also let's make it darker. So we have all our text at 555, and this one we will make 333. So another gray color, let's add that here to our palette, let's say. And yeah, and I will talk a little bit more about these colors a bit later on. So the reason why we chose them, and we might also experiment a little bit with other colors, but for now, just follow what I'm doing here. Okay, then let's try the hero description. So as always, changing the font size, of course. Here, let's try to go with 20 pixels maybe. So 2 rem. And here we can use a little more line height as well. Okay, nice. Maybe a little bit more line height even. And then of course, we finally need some spacing here as well. So we need some spacing here. So after the H1, and then some spacing here after this paragraph, right? And remember that we're still iterating our design here. So we're just trying out here things a little bit for now, because actually we don't even have yet a font family selected, right? And so we can tweak all of this later. We just need some starting base here from which we can then improve. Okay. For example, I can actually see here in this heading that we should probably decrease the letter spacing because this text here is very large. And as we learned in one of the design rules, many times it then looks unnatural with the big space between the letters. And here that is actually the case. So let's remove that a little bit as well. So let's say half a pixel. So minus 0.5 pixels. And here notice how I'm not using rem, and that's because this is just a very small distance here, and it's also a distance that we don't really need to scale up or down. And so then we can simply keep using pixels in those situations. So here I said I was going to increase this a little bit, and now let's think about our spacing. So after the H1, let's add like 32 pixels. And then after the paragraph, a little bit more. So maybe 48 here. And so that's because the heading and the paragraph belong kind of together. And then after that, we want more space between the buttons because they are a bit separated from these two text contents. So as I said, here we're going to use a margin bottom of 32 pixels. So 3.2 rem. And then here I'm going with 4.8 rem, so 48 pixels. Okay, nice. So this one looks a bit more natural now with the decreased letter spacing, and here we have some nice spacing on as well. Now let's just quickly vertically center this content here, so all of this what's in this box, and that should be fairly easy, right? Because remember that we are using a grid, and so on the grid container, we can simply, as always, use align items and set it to center. Okay, nice. But of course, then we have some problem with the spacing here. And so let's now actually tackle all of the spacing in this section. So of course, there's also no spacing here, kind of between the beginning of the page and this hero image. So this entire section here. And so let's now indeed think a bit more about the visual style of this section, which includes not only the spacing, but also the colors. So remember that we're using the startup website personality here. And in that personality, it's quite common to have a very light background colors in some of the sections. So usually that is using a gray color. But here in this design, we actually also want to include some elements of the calm personality. Remember that? And so I think it would be nicer to not use a gray color, which is a little bit colder, but actually use a very, very light shade or a tint, maybe, I don't remember which one it is, but basically a very light version of our primary orange color. So let's get that color here. I'll copy this hex code and then remember about this tool that I mentioned to you, which is the tints and shades generator. And as always, this link here will be on my resources page, but the one that I like to use is this one. So make tintsandshades.com. So we just come here, then paste the code here, and then simply make tints and shades. And so here we now get these 10 shades, so the darker versions, and then all of these lighter versions. So it starts basically at the color that we selected and goes all the way to white here, and here it starts at our selected color, goes all the way to black, right? And so let's now choose this very first color here as our background color, just to see if that looks nice. So we can click here, it will then copy it. And so let's try that. So we want this entire hero section, right? So not just the hero. Let me first put that here so that you can see why we don't want it just here. Right. So that looked quite strange because usually what we see is that the entire section from left to right has the background color, right? And so here we have actually one more reason why we needed this hero container element inside of the hero section. So, or actually the section hero. So let's move that up here by hitting Alt or Option up. Give it a save. And, well, I think that this looks quite nice. If we went with a darker color like this one here, then I think it would look like too dark. So the contrast would be too high. Yeah. So you could go with this one, but yeah, I prefer the little bit lighter version. So let's just keep it like this, and I'll copy it here and basically add it to our color palette here. So for now we just have this tint, but probably we will have more a bit later on. Okay, and now we need to add some spacing. So we want space inside of this element, not outside of it. So in order to preserve the background color, basically. So when we have background color, we always use padding. And so top and bottom, we want a lot of space, because this is basically now the space that's between sections. And so here we want a lot of space. So, well, maybe not this much, but 96 pixels I think will look good. And this is also the value that we used in our other project. So let's go with that. So 9.6 rem top and bottom. And on the sides for now, we need nothing. And then, since we're talking about spacing here, let's add the exact same space also inside of the grid. So as the gap between these columns. So that's gap. And then for consistency, I'm going to use the exact same value here. All right. Beautiful. So this is starting to look like something, right? Now, here we can now style these buttons maybe as a next step. I think that would be a good idea. So that's the button class here. So let's just put that here. And actually, since this is a link and not an actual button element, we need to actually style these pseudo classes. So button link and button visited here at the same time. Let's give it our primary color as a background. So that's where the branding of the client comes in. This is one design decision we don't have to take, fortunately. Then the font size, let's put it at 2 rem, so 20 pixels. As for the text color, let's also make it white, so FFF. Then let's take care of the padding, and this is an inline element, and so in order for the padding to work as expected, we need to make it inline block so that the box model applies as usual. So this is something that we have done multiple times already, right? And so here I'm going to go with 16 pixels top and bottom, and 32 pixels, so 3.2 rem to the left and right. So once more, here I like to use double the size on the sides than on top and bottom. Okay, and then let's experiment with some border radius here, maybe 15 pixels. And of course, we are forgetting the text decoration, and the border radius, I think, looks a little bit too much. Now we could, of course, also make it really big. Let's just see what that looks like. Let's just remove the text decoration here very quick. And as I said, we need to make it an inline block as well. So display I like to use at the very top. Inline block. Okay. So here we have the completely rounded corners, right? But for some reason, I don't really like it in this design. And we might circle back to it a little bit later. But for now, I just want to make them really like a lot smaller. So let's say 9 pixels here. And yeah, that's actually a lot better. Okay, now there is just one problem here, which is that right now these two buttons here do have exactly the same color, right? But that is not exactly what we want, because now both of these buttons are competing for the user's attention. However, only this one here is important, and this one is a lot less important. And so we only want this one here to be orange, and this here should be a bit more invisible, so to say. So the focus or the emphasis should really lie on our main call to action button and not on this one. And so we need two different styles. And so what I will do is to, of course, leave this one orange, and then we can make this one white, because with this background color here, that should then look quite nice. So let's add here what I call a modifier class. And once again, we have done this multiple times already, which is to basically define the common styles in the button, so just in this, and then we can add some more specific styles to this button full class, and then also here to the other button, which I'm calling button outline. Okay? So let's see what I mean by that. So button full, and of course I could have called it also button CTA for call to action, or really any other thing, but this one will have the full back color, and so that's why I like to call it full. And then again, we need all these different pseudo classes, right? And so now what is actually specific to this one here? Well, it is the background color, right? So let's put that one here, and then let's just copy this to make it a bit easier. So the outline should be white. Okay. Nice. Except that we cannot see the text here. And so that's because the white text is also specific to this one. And then here we want to have the darker color. So then we will get the default color of 555. Well, actually we don't. So we get this blue default link color. And so let's set that here. Well, and now let's actually worry about our hover states here. So this button here, when we hover it, we want to make it a little bit darker. And this other outline button here, we can actually give it the same background color as the rest of the section when it's hovered. Okay, so let's just copy this here. And so here, let's say hover and active. So how do we get the darker color? Well, we actually already generated it. So it's right here. And so the darker colors are these ones here. And so let's simply get this next one here, which is just a tiny bit darker, but it should be enough. So let's copy that. And yeah, here we don't need this. Let's do the same right here. So hover. And here the background color that we want is this one. Oh, and here we need this. And let's see. Nice. So it gets darker as intended. And here the button kind of disappears now. So this does actually look a little bit unnatural. So we should add maybe some of white border here around this button. And that's actually harder than it sounds like. So let me show it to you. So let's just try at a border of 3 pixels solid white. So just like this. And you see what happens. The border kind of gets added to the outside. And so then when we hover it, the entire layout jumps a little bit. Right? Can that. And so of course we don't want that. So what we need basically is to add the border to the inside of the button. Okay. And for that we can use a trick that I'm going to show you now, which is actually not using the border property, but the box shadow property. So that sounds strange. So this trick, let me actually write it down here to add border inside. And so we use box shadow without any offset in any direction. So not horizontally and not vertically. We also don't want it to have any blur, right? But we want to scale it basically by 3 pixels. So that's basically the same 3 pixels that we had here in the border. And then finally, we again simply make the color white, just as we did here. Okay. So like this, it would basically create the same effect as here. And so let's add the missing piece here, which is the inset keyword. So with this inset keyword, the shadow will basically be added to the side of the element. So exactly what we want. And it would be helpful if we had this inset keyword on the border actually, but we don't. So we cannot do that. So we need to use this box shadow trick to basically replicate the border and then put it inset. And so with this, you see that we now achieve this nice looking effect here. Okay. Now, right now, these hover effects here, they don't look really nice and really professional, because if we were to go to a real world website and hover over some button, then we would actually see a nice animation from one color to the other. But that's not at all what we have here, right? Here it simply jumps basically from one color directly to the other one. And so now let me show you yet another trick in which we can fix that. So basically create a nice animation using just CSS. So to do that, we basically come to the element, so to the rule which has the original state. And so that is, in this case, simply this link and visit it, right? So this is the state before any hover. And so here we can now add the transition property. So transition property is a property that allows us to do just what it says. So to transition between two values using an animation. Then here we can specify multiple things, but at least we need two things. We need the property that we actually want to animate, and we need to say over how much time we want the animation to happen. Now, in this case, we want to animate both the background color and the color, right? Now, in this case, we want to animate both the background color and the color, right? And so we can actually just say all. And so with this, all the properties will be animated. Okay. And then again, over how many times we want the animation to happen. And so let's just start here with 1 second. So here we can choose S for second, or we could also specify milliseconds. So that would be for 1 second, 1000 milliseconds. But I like to always use seconds. That's a bit more natural. And so let's see what happens now as we hover over the button. And you see that it nicely changed the color here over 1 second. You see that? And the same is now happening here. Now, of course, this is way too slow, but this was just to show you the effect. To make it a bit more visible, let's put the hover state to another color. Let's say red as my favorite color here. All right. And you see that changed over 1 second. And here, of course, it's still the same. Okay. And I noticed that actually we are only changing the background color and not the color. And here we could also have written this. So instead of all, we say just background color. Right? Then here we could also specify a third value to change the type of the animation, but that is a little bit more complex, so I'm going to leave that for later. Okay, so here I just wanted to introduce you to this brand new CSS property, so at least brand new for you, because it's been around for some years, but for you it is a new property, and it is actually a really exciting one, because it allows us to do animations in a very, very simple way. And animation here, basically what we mean is to change the value of a certain property or of multiple properties from one value to another one. So in this case, that is from this background color to this one here. All right. And remember, always put the transition here on the original state. I'll actually write that down here for you. So state is not really a correct CSS term, but I think you know what I mean there. Now here, 1 second is of course way too long. So let's use a better value. And something that is commonly used is 0.3 seconds. So that's 300 milliseconds. And so with this, we have a nice and snappy animation, which feels quite natural. Beautiful. Now, there's just one more thing that we need to fix, which is the space here between these buttons. So this is of course not enough space that we have here. So this doesn't look natural at all. And so we need to add some spacing here between those two. Now, how should we do this? I mean, this button full here should probably be reused in a later point on this side. And so therefore, I will not simply add a margin to the right here in this element. Right? I mean, of course, I could do this like 1.6 rem, and that would then work quite nicely, right? But then if I added this button here somewhere else on the page, that would also get the same margin right. And so that's not what we want. Now another option here would to wrap these two buttons into some grid container or flex container and then add some gap into that one, right? But that seems like a bit too much work here. So that's also not what I want. But instead, what I'm going to do here is to add a special helper class to this button here. So let me just write it and then I will explain what this is. I'm going to call it margin right and SM for small. Okay. And so this will be like a reusable and very generic helper class that I can now define in my CSS and then add to multiple elements to give them some space on the right side. So let's say 1.6 rem. Okay. And so now here it looks exactly the same as before, but we achieved that using this technique of using a helper class like this. Okay. Now, when we use a helper class like this, we really want the style that it has to be applied. And no matter what other styles are already on the element. So in order to ensure that, we usually then add the important keyword here. Because remember, that then makes sure that this style here, so this declaration here, always has the highest priority. So in this case, that wouldn't be necessary, but that's just a good practice to do. Okay? And with experience, you will of course then know when you should use a class like this. And also I will show you a couple more use cases throughout this project. But many times it is actually related to margins that we want to reuse in multiple places, but that we do not want to add to specific elements. Because then when we want to reuse them somewhere else, it might create some conflicts that we don't want. Okay, and I hope that made sense. And here, of course, yeah, we don't need to use the link and the visited pseudo classes because this class here is intended to use on all kinds of elements, not just on buttons. But anyway, let's go back here. And now this section here looks quite nice already. So really great work. Until this point, it looks really beautiful already. Now, next up, we want to add a small component down here, which has these customer faces that I showed you by the start on last lecture. And then I think it's also time to select a really nice typeface for our project. Okay. And so we will do all of that in the next part of building the hero section. Let's now continue building and actually finish building our hero section. And in this part 3 of building the hero, let's actually start by selecting a new typeface. So for that, we will again use Google Fonts. And of course, we need to keep in mind the website personality that we chose. And so that's why I will first show you the Inter typeface, which, as I mentioned before, is kind of my new favorite. So let's just select a couple here, maybe 4, 5, and 700 here. And then we just copy these two lines here. So we already did this a couple of times before. And then remember, we need to paste it before our own style sheet. And now I will simply add Inter here first. And then as a fallback, if Inter doesn't work somehow, then sans serif will be used. So let's check that out. And now indeed, if you ask me, it does look a lot better than before. However, I'm not sure if this really fits our personality type so well. I mean, if it was just the startup personality, then I think Inter is actually a perfect font. But remember that we're also trying to mix some of the personality traits of the calm personality into our design. And so I think that we should use a little bit of a rounder typeface here. So Enter is a little bit harsh. So look just at this L here. It's like a complete square, like a complete rectangle, and there is nothing round about it. And so maybe this doesn't fit so nice with the overall message of the site and of course with the website personality. So we will not choose Enter actually. So I will remove all here. And instead, let's go back. And now, of course, you could now spend a lot of time searching for the right typeface for this design. All right. But I already did that work before, because otherwise we would lose a lot of time here. And the perfect typeface that I think fits really nicely into our design is called Rubik. So exactly this one here. Okay, and so let's now select a couple here. So 400 as always. Then I'm actually going with 4, 5, 6, and 700. Okay, and in case we wanted italic text, then we would actually also have to select these italic styles. But I think we will not need that. And so for now, I will just leave it like this. And then up here, we have our selected families. And then we can just copy this one again. Okay. Replace this one here. And then Rubik right here. And wait for it. And there we go. So this typeface, I think, is really, really beautiful. And it's really a nice mix between the startup personality, but making it a little bit more approachable and looking a bit more caring by being basically a bit more round. So comparing this L here with the one we had before, now it has these nicely rounded corners, and the same is of course true for all the other characters here as well. So really nice. Let's make this here actually the whole size. And yeah, so I think this is the perfect typeface. But as I said, usually when I build a project like this, I keep experimenting throughout the entire project with different typefaces, even at the very end, to see which one fits best. And so when we reach the end of this project, we might also do that again, because then it's a perfect time to see the entire layout changing the way it looks, simply by using some different typefaces. But for now, as a work in progress, I think this one here is great. Let's just make these buttons here a little bit bolder now that we have that 600 font weight. So you see that by default we have 400, and then 700 is like really bold. But to make it just a little bit less bold, we can use 600. And so that's what I want to use here on the button. So font weight of 600, and that does look a lot nicer. Okay, but finally, let's build that component that I mentioned in the very first part of building this hero, which is to have like some customer photos here, and then with some relevant data. And I thought of that because here in this description, we have this sentence here. So basically saying that OmniFood delivered 250,000 meals last year, which is kind of really impressive, right? And so I think this gets a bit lost here in this sentence. And so I thought that we could add a nice component here that I saw in that other inspiration. So in that other example. And yeah, I wanted to do the same here, basically based on that example. So let's do that. And if we take a look at our images, we actually do have, should be here in the customers. So we have a lot of photos here of customers that we can use. So 6 of them. So let's come back here into our hero text box. and basically add that here after these buttons. So again, using a very generic div element, and then I will call it delivered meals. Then here inside these meals, we need one box for the face images and then another box for the text, or maybe just some paragraph for that text. But anyway, let's call this one here the delivered faces. Okay, could be delivered images as well. Let's actually call it IMGs for images to be a bit more consistent. And then of course our image element source. So that's in IMG. And here we have yet another folder. So IMG / customers / customer once. Okay, and here let's add very simple alt text. This is just some customer photo. Okay. Now I'm copying this and pasting it a couple of times because we have 6 of them. So this looks a bit strange. So here I don't really agree with the prettier formatting. Yeah, that's a lot better. So here you see they are called 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we just need to replace them here. And I will leave the alt text without any change. Okay, and then here I want that paragraph with the text. So let's get that actually. So it's this one here, right? So of course, actually it's also here. So let me just cut it from here and paste it here. And just to make it a little bit nicer and shorter, let's just say 250,000 meals delivered last year. Okay, let's check that out again. And indeed, that doesn't look so correct. And so we now need to build this small layout for this small component. So that's called delivered meals. And again, I will fix this CSS file here a little bit later because it's starting to get a bit confusing. But anyway, so we want the delivered meals to be side by side with that paragraph. So a good use case is using display flex. And this time I'm actually using flex and not grid because here I don't really care about the size of the columns. We will simply let the content determine the sizes. Okay. Then delivered, well, not meals, but images. So here we also want these images to be side by side. So all the child elements here of delivered images, which are these images, should also become flex elements. And so now let's format these images. But here I didn't give them any class. And well, I usually do that when it goes so many levels deep. So here I would now have to call them like delivered IG, but that's a bit too much trouble, maybe. So I'm just going to select the IMG using this descendant selector. So let's give them some height. So based, of course, again here on our rules. So maybe 64 pixels. And if that is too big, we go one step down to 48. So 64, which means 6.4 RAM. And well, usually we do not need to specify a width because it will automatically get adjusted. But there is some bug in the Safari browser when the images are flex items. And so we need to do that here as well. So we simply set the width to the exact same thing to make them squared. Okay, and then we also want to make them round. And since they are squared, we can set the border radius to 50%. Remember that? And so let's check it out, maybe, or actually let's first also style this paragraph here, which I didn't actually give a class. So that's delivered text, let's say. Okay. So to give it some visual hierarchy here, let's make it smaller than the paragraph text that we had before, that summary. So where is that? It's right here. So it's at 2 rem. And so let's go one step down, which is 1.8 rem. So 18 pixels. So here we are using all of these ideas about visual hierarchy with text and with the entire layout in general as well. And let's give it some font weight, maybe of 600 to make it stand out more from the rest. Okay, so that's starting to look like something, but these images are way too big for now. So let's fix that. And we also need some spacing here, so some vertical spacing between this component and this button. So let's start with that, actually. And, well, we cannot really add any spacing simply to the buttons here, right? So again, that would then be against the idea that these buttons should be standalone components. So there's also the reason why here I added this margin using this helper class, right? So I could create a margin bottom or something class like that, but then I would have added to both these buttons, and I think that's not really worth it, because what we can do instead is to simply add some margin to the top of this element here. So delivered meals. So margin top in this case, and here let's use a lot. So maybe 80 pixels. So not quite the 96. That would be a bit too much, but let's try 8 rem here. Okay. And then, make the images smaller. So stepping down from 64, the next one is 48 pixels. So 4.8 rem. Okay. And so that is a lot better already. Great. Now what we need to fix is to add some spacing here and align these vertically. And then one very nice thing that we can do here is to kind of overlap these images here on top of each other. So that's something that we see quite often when we have a situation like this, because, well, it looks a bit strange. So we can just overlap them. And I'm sure you have seen this also in practice before. So starting with the spacing and vertical aligning, that is right here on this delivered meals flex container. And so here we need to then add align items, remember, to center everything vertically. And then some spacing, we use our gap property. And let's use 16 pixels, so 1.6 rem. Okay, so that fixes that first part. And now remember, the second thing that we wanted to do is to put these images on top of each other. So basically we want to decrease the spacing between them. And so we might think that since we are using a flex container here, so this delivered images, which contains the images, is also a flex container. And so we might think that here we could set the gap property to a negative value. However, for some reason that doesn't really work. And so here we actually need to work on the individual images themselves. So here we can add a margin to the right with a negative value. And so let's again use, for consistency, 1.6 rem, but then negatively. And so that will basically pull each of the images 16 pixels more to the left. All right. Yeah, so exactly like this. Now, for some reason, the margin, so this gap is not really being applied. Let's see what's happening there. And so this is where, once again, the dev tools come in very handy. Just make this a bit bigger so you can actually see. So the problem is that the Flex container basically ends right here. And the reason for that is that all images have this negative margin. Well, it's not really visible here, but we need to basically remove the negative margin from this last one here. That should then fix it. So then this end of the Flex container should be back here, and then we'll be able to see that margin that is now on top of the image. So let's select the last one. And for that, fortunately, we have our very handy last child pseudo class. And so here we set the margin back to 0. So we could have written margin right as well, but here basically we're setting all the margins back to 0. Now, okay. And now that is fixed indeed. Right. Now just one more thing, or actually two more things. So first I want to make this one here a bit more visible. And so I'm also giving it this orange color here. And then another thing that we do many times when we overlap images like this is to then add a nice small border to each of them to create basically some visible space between them. And you will see what I mean in a second here once I do that. So basically what I just said is to add a border, let's say 3 pixel solid with the exact same background color as the color that is around the images. So if that was white, we would use white, but in this case, that is this background color right here. Actually, it is this color, but it's not coming from here. I mean, it is here from this section hero, right? So that's right here. Right. So this looks a bit nicer. It's just a small detail you might think in the small touch, but it makes it immediately a bit more designed. So as if someone thought a little bit more about this component. And so that is always a good thing to do. Now, finally, as I said, I want to make this text here orange in order to make it stand out a bit more. So let's wrap it in a span element, which is like a generic text element. So a bit like a div element for inline elements. So let's select that again with a descendant selector instead of adding just another class there. So our brand color is this one here, I think. Let's make sure. Yeah, it's always the one that ends in 22. But since we're already here, let's make it even a little bit bolder. So going all the way to 700. Okay, nice. Let's just make sure that the contrast ratio is actually good here. Because here we are actually using this orange color on top of another orange color. Even though this one here is very light, but I'm actually not sure if it has the correct color contrast ratio. So to check this, we go to this coolers or something website, which one more time it is on my resources page. Then we click away all this stuff. Then here we come to contrast checker. Then we paste our text color here. Well, I'm not sure what that is. It was this text that I copied before. So indeed I want this. And the background color is this one here. And so you see it is very poor. So this red background means that we are in trouble. So let's use the next arc that we have. So this one here. Let's copy this. Let's make sure it's here already. Actually, it's not. So just again to make sure we have everything in one place. Let's put that here. And it is still poor here, but down here it just became yellow, which is for a large text. But if we take a look here, then we see that level AA requires 3.1 for large text, so at least 18 pixels, or bold text. And in our case, the text is actually very bold, and so I think we're good to go with that color here. So let's replace that, and there we go. So you think that this might be a very minor thing to work out, but as I said, I believe, and the whole web developer community believes as well, that we should really strive to make our websites as accessible as possible. And so I think it's not too much to worry about a small detail like this. Okay, with this, we actually finished building this hero section. So I hope that you like this result. I think it looks really, really beautiful. So great result here. We have nice visual hierarchy where this text here is closer a little bit to this one because they belong kind of together. Then we have a bit more space between the buttons and then a lot more space. Well, actually not that much space, but still there's a lot more space here than here. And so again, we create a nice visual hierarchy right there. Let me just remember how much we used here. It looks like it's not that much. It was 8 RAM, while here we have 4.8 RAM. But then because of line height, it is actually a bit more, as we can see here in this blue box that is around it. But still, I think this looks good. Also the spacing between these columns and around everything here looks quite decent. And so yeah, I think this is done for now. And so next lecture, we will then also build the header here. So putting the logo here and also start working a bit on the navigation. So that is yet another exciting step to really polish off and finish this whole introduction to our website. And so hopefully see you there very soon.